singular art form informed basically every subsequent genre of music in the United States. Its impact cannot be overstated. To give you some sense of this, I'm talking about blues, soul, funk, jazz, R&B, hip hop, drum and bass, techno, funk, house, electro, like the amount of genres that came as a result of spirituals, or the genres that spirituals then created, it's basically every single genre of music that came since then in this country, especially. So it is everything from bebop to disco, hip hop to techno, blues, rock, jazz, all of this, every little bit of it can be traced back to the spiritual. The composer Alice Parker once reflected that man's inhumanity to man should often produce great art is one of the biggest mysteries of the human spirit. The history of spirituals is a history of oppression. We enslaved our brothers and sisters for 12 generations, I did the math, which is an astonishing amount of times the word great must precede grandparent before finding a blood relative whose life was not held in the white man's fist. So it should not come as a surprise to us that spirituals challenge us in many ways. Spirituals are also called, well, they were originally called sorrow songs. There are about 5,000 of them in existence that we know of today, and all of them were written by anonymous poets, musicians whose names we will never know because they were slaves. As you may have guessed, these are all pieces of music that passed down through the oral tradition. They were never formally notated, so it's really kind of hard to study them for many reasons. But one of them is that there's just so little record. We don't know a lot about the religions of African peoples in the 1800s, but we do hypothesize is that they shared a common belief, which is the belief in a single supreme deity. So unlike the Europeans, who connected to God through a vast catalog of saints, their connection was through the ancestors, which was very different. One of my favorite experts on the spirituals is the late, great Joe Carter. Some of you may have heard of him. He was a singer and a music educator and ambassador. He died very young at the age of 57 from leukemia quite a few years back. And anyway, Carter's understanding is that when African peoples were enslaved, they were ripped apart from one of the most important elements of their religious beliefs, which was the connection to the land of their ancestors. The divine was reached by connecting to their ancestors from the very soil on which they lived. They lost all of this when they crossed the ocean. They lost all of this and so much more. So Carter explains further that although the early slaves were certainly not impressed with the religion of their masters, they were able to see the blatant hypocrisy of this so-called Christian behavior. They were, however, intrigued by this character named Jesus. You see, here was a man who was born into terrible circumstances, who was mistreated, who was beaten, who was finally killed at the hands of his abusers, yet he was the son of the high God. So the life of Jesus was, for them, relatable. Our understanding is that these early slaves experienced God as being extremely holy and also extremely busy. But if you sang fervently enough, you could also commune in some capacity with God. You may already know, probably some of you already know, that the language of spirituals is a coded one. Every tune had hidden meaning, secret sharing, freedom seeking, from a very broad religious sense to an extremely logistical, practical one. I'm talking about lyrics that are literally intending to teach slaves how to escape, literally offering up the information that they need to escape. You may recognize this tune. Let's see if my keyboard works on this. Steal away, steal away, steal away to Jesus. Steal away home. I ain't got long to stay here. I don't know if you can tell, but there's a keyboard behind me right there. Do you recognize that song? How many of us recognize that song? Everybody recognize, hey, participation. Yes, everybody recognizes that song. To my understanding, I think the choristers, Enid, you'd have to correct me on this. I believe the choristers sang an arrangement of this, or like last year at some point. Yeah. Gorgeous song.
Beautiful. They sing it all the time.
They sing it all the time. Fabulous. Beautiful song. This tune is called Steal Away. The refrain is green trees are bending, poor sinner stands a trembling. What is that about? Well, it's literally someone shaking tree branches on the other side of the river, signaling an escape. That's the green trees that are bending. So it's still a way to freedom, literally, quite literally. We often hear references of the River Jordan, for example, but they're not actually about the River Jordan. It's about the Ohio River, right? We also hear references to chariots, to moving feet, to calls to be ready. These are lyrics that are literally meant to inform others about escape plans. Dr. Horace Clarence remarks, the spirituals are religious, but only about 50 to 60%. The rest is instructional. There is so much hope as well as darkness in these tunes. Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, which you may know. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. This song is symbolic of death. So like many others, this was a death song, wanting death over life in captivity. It was also frequently sung after a child died. God will bring me a golden chariot. There will be dignity for me. There will be dignity for my deceased child. And if you get there before I do, how does it go? Tell all my friends I'm coming too, right? I talked once with the composer Tom Trenny, who some of you may recognize that name. He's pretty fabulous. I talked with him about his experience learning spirituals and the songs behind them. And I remember him sitting down with me and very earnestly telling me that once he actually really sat with the lyrics for Soon I Will Be Done with the Troubles of the World. Soon I will be done with the troubles of the world. He could never sing it the same way again. He could never sing it really quickly and flippantly as it's so often done. Soon I will be done with it. This is talking about death. This is talking about death, wanting dignity and salvation and final liberation on the other side. Joe Carter talks about a story he heard from an older African-American woman. Her name's Jessie Anthony, about Emancipation Day. Remember, all of these stories, much like the songs that they're about, have been passed down by word of mouth for generation after generation after generation. So Jessie Anthony tells this story on what the slaves assumed would be Emancipation Day. The town emissary, what does he do? He comes over by boat to share the news with the slaves, who are anxiously waiting with bated breath about this news, to hear the news of emancipation. On an island off the coast of South Carolina, the slaves are hushed and they're waiting. And as the boat gets closer, they notice that his facial expression is one of sorrow. And they realize, much to their dismay, that the day has not yet, in fact, come for them. So an older woman in the crowd stands up and begins wailing and singing, "Nobody knows the trouble I've seen," right? "Sometimes I'm up, sometimes I'm down. Oh, yes, Lord, sometimes I'm almost on the ground. Oh, yes, Lord." She's singing from a place of solidarity, deep solidarity that I will never know, to the people, for the people, with the people. And it's this communal expression of sorrow in the highest form. Again, the slaves were people who came from Africa, and they found solace and hope in the son of the high God, who was also held captive, who was also persecuted, also whipped, also chained. There's a fabulous setting of We Shall Walk Through the Valley in Peace. Has anybody heard that one? That's a little lesser known. Yeah, a little lesser known. There's a fabulous setting of it by Moses Hogan, who's probably the most significant composer and arranger of spirituals. And I've found, unfortunately, very few gospel and spiritual arrangements in our choral library at Trinity so far, but we do have this one. We do have this one, and I really hope that our choirs can sing it someday, because it's so fabulous. I'm so glad we have this one. And the setting is, in my opinion, just as rich as the text that it holds. And it says, "There will be no trials there. There will be no trials there. For Jesus himself will be our leader. We shall walk through the valley in peace." What does it mean to be led through the valley? What does it mean to follow a leader who himself was oppressed? Wade in the Water, I played a piano arrangement of this morning. Let's see, what key did I play it in? I can't remember what key I played it in. Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. This is a song. Well, there are many theories about this song. And again, so many of our understandings of spirituals are exactly that. They're just theories. But there are many theories about it and its message of salvation, because obviously in scripture, as you all probably know better than I do, there are so many references to water symbolizing transformation, water symbolizing healing. The slaves also sought freedom through river passageways because water masked their scent from the dogs. So there's a connection that could be made here to the teachings of Jesus. Do you want to be healed? All right, then take up your bed and walk with me through the river, right? There's also this message of self-sufficiency, of self-sufficiency, sung by strong people of a great faith, a faith which, despite unimaginable hardships, prevented them from seeing themselves as victims. There are some things you simply will not find in spirituals as a genre. You won't find any whining. You won't find any mean-spirited sentiments. You won't find any victimizing or criticizing. These are the most noble expressions of our Christian faith. It was, Joe Carter explains this, and it always just absolutely gets to the core of me. It was Mammy who took care of the master's baby, not the wife of the household, right? She could have smothered or killed that child, but she didn't. She didn't do that because her faith said, no, you have to be loving. God requires you to be loving. God requires you to be kind. There are no excuses. So this is the oppressed, raising the oppressor's child and holding on to dignity and sharing these songs with that child too, as lullabies. There are so many layers to this that we just really can't fathom. They're more than just church songs, right? I'm about to use Joe Carter's exact words here and now to express the next song, because his words are so much more powerful than anything I could say or sing. And it's about the song, It's Me, O Lord, Standing in the Need of Prayer. How many of us know that one? It's me, O Lord, standing in the need of prayer. Hallelujah, Lord, it's me. Right. So he explains, and I quote, now you find a song like this. It's me, oh Lord, standing in the need of prayer. Not my brother, not my sister, but it's me, oh Lord. Not the preacher, not the deacon, but it's me, oh Lord. Not the doctor, not the lawyer, not the master. Wait a second. These are people who were victims. They were in the midst of a most horrible situation, and they said, I am taking responsibility for who I am today, and it's me standing in the need of prayer. I'm the one with the proud heart. Come and fix me. End quote. I would be remiss, of course, if I didn't also mention another really important scriptural tie, which is, of course, the story of Exodus. Go Down Moses, a song that I assume many of us know and love. How does it go? Go down, Moses, way down to Egypt land and tell old Pharaoh, let my people go. How do you think the slaves experienced this story? There are so many stories. There are so many songs, every single one of them with a rich history, many of which we're only guessing at and picking up from all these pieces that were handed down from generation to generation. And one of the greatest ironies, one of the greatest sort of weirdnesses to all of this is that slave masters were really happy to hear them singing. Why? Because they could tell exactly where they were and that they weren't escaping because they were singing. In fact, masters used to encourage singing, all the while staying completely oblivious to the meaning behind these songs. This was cleverness on many levels. These slaves were not, in fact, singing for the masters, of course. They were singing for each other. They were singing for themselves. So they outsmarted the masters. And this kind of mental strength is also really evident in the necessity that they had to have imaginations. And I mean that as a quite serious thing. I mean imagination is a quite serious thing, because to live in the land that they did at the time that they did in the way that they did, they had to find ways to keep the faith and to imagine the kingdom of God. They had to keep this inner dignity and inner freedom of soul. So just as I can never truly understand the depth behind spirituals, as I have not lived the life they resulted from, just as I don't believe music to be a universal language, but universally experienced, there is suffering everywhere. Even the most privileged among us, those born into freedom and prosperity and opportunities at education, there is suffering still. None of us are immune to suffering, and none of us can escape it while we're on this earth. So if you go to churches in Scotland, if you go to churches in South Korea, you'll find spirituals in their hymnals. This is someone else's song, anonymously written, centuries removed, situationally very different. But you can hear someone singing, "Sometimes I feel like a motherless child," to someone who doesn't speak English, but they will likely understand the emotional tone and the depth of that melody. Spirituals took on a whole new meaning during the civil rights era, of course, when Martin Luther King Jr. reintroduced them through a new lens of liberation. I think of Dorothy Cotton, the civil rights leader, adapting the lyrics of "Have you got good religion?" Certainly, certainly, Lord. "Are you registered to vote?" Certainly, certainly, Lord. I ran my notes by a friend of mine last night who reminded me of the Harlem Renaissance as well in the early 1900s and the celebration of Black culture and Black music that is so much more than the lamentations of slavery and collective trauma. And so it's also about the celebration of spirit, the lifting up of strength and soul. There's like so many things we could talk about right now, you guys. We could talk about the rise of jazz, which stemmed directly from spirituals and its tremendous impact on American culture. We could talk about the intersection of Black culture and LGBTQ culture and the influence of Black music in the early club scene in Chicago and Detroit and New York. We could talk about how white churches began to include spirituals in their hymnals and different denominational approaches to this kind of musical inclusion. There is so much more depth that we could go into right now. And it's hard to kind of pick where to go from here as I kind of close out my talk. But I think for the remaining minutes of my time, if I haven't totally bored you yet, I'd like to share something which I think is a little hard to talk about, but I believe it to be very necessary. Also, I love ending speeches on a thinker note, on many of them, hopefully. But I believe it's really necessary for us to also recognize the smallness of the lens through which we have historically and still do experience music. The lens through which we understand and assess music. Because, and I'm fascinated by this, we are just beginning to, right now in 2021, just beginning to address the reality of whiteness and how we teach and understand music. Chances are, many of you have been exposed to some kind of music education in your lives, whether it was singing in a choir, taking private lessons, taking music classes in school. Raise your hand if you had some kind of music education. Every single one of you. Look at that. So you were probably taught about major and minor scales. You're probably taught about chords and triads, all these sort of building blocks that are taught in every class of music theory and music history and training, ear training and oral training and orchestration, all these sorts of things. We call this music theory. The theory of music theory. But really, it could be more accurately titled the harmonic style of 18th century white, male, straight European musicians. We don't call it white music theory. We don't call it Western music theory. We don't call it 18th century music theory. We just call this music theory. And so in teaching it as such, we're making this huge unspoken assumption that all music should be understood through this really limited racist lens. What we think of as music theory actually does a really bad job at describing most music across the globe, and also a really bad job at valuing it. Now, if you're thinking if in your heads, you're probably thinking many things right now, and maybe you're thinking something along the lines of, okay, yes, all right, Michelle, I get the spirituals are really important and really beautiful, but Mozart and Beethoven are still the greatest composers to ever have lived. And the musical style that originates from these straight white Western European men between 1700 and 1930 is still really the best in the world and should be taught as that. I encourage you to look a little deeper. Is that what you believe because it's the only thing you were exposed to? Do you consider that music to be high art and therefore more culturally significant than any other? Is it because the only lens through which you were taught to appreciate music is that of the 18th century straight white European male composers? So don't get me wrong. I absolutely believe that Bach and Beethoven deserve seats at the table. In fact, I mean, this is the stuff that I studied too. I went to music school. And I just don't think they should have the whole table. So assuming I haven't absolutely terrified you guys and that in some future date I would be invited to do another adult forum, I assure you that I would gladly lead something on Bach chorales, for example. I love that stuff and I would love to lead something on Bach chorales. I argue that music is not a universal language, although it may be experienced universally. It's only understood through the lens of culture and by extension, what that culture chooses to value. So I could have a whole other conversation about, for example, how limiting and unhelpful the term classical music is. I have very strong feelings about that, but we'll save that for another day. How does this apply to our understanding of spirituals? Well, if we put spirituals through this lens, if we put this genre exclusively through the lens that we're taught through all these different forms of music education, both historical and current to this day, this is how we teach music, a lens that emphasizes the supremacy of white composers of a very specific time and of very specific countries, and open our eyes to nothing else, what would we conclude about spirituals? Well, the lyrics are really repetitive and they're vernacular. So, I guess they're not as poetic or as refined as that of Wagnerian opera. The chord structures, they're really simple, maybe just like 3 or 4 chords. So, guess it can't hold a candle to those harmonic complexities of Bach. Well, they're not really notated, right? So they're kind of common. There's no nuance in orchestration or indication of dynamics or phrasing. So, gosh, it must not be very important or good or worth studying. How foolish and small-minded we would be to experience spirituals like this. I think the American spiritual is one of the most profound genres of art, and I am honored to be able to participate in the playing and singing of them when given the chance and when it is appropriate to do so. And I'm honored to talk about them as a musician, understanding that I will never truly know the experience that caused them to be born, or how it really feels to be singing them from that perspective, generations removed. I also don't really know how to conclude this talk. So I hope you're still with me. I hope some of this was interesting for you. Again, I haven't been to an adult forum yet, so I don't know how this is in comparison to other ones that you've done, but this has been really enjoyable for me to really dig a little deeper into this and then share some of the things that I think about and that I've found on these topics, as it is such a rich tradition.